Thanks, Sean. I won't depress people and talk too long about waiting lists and put people in bad form. So I'll just start first of all by encouraging people to buy a ticket for the raffle. And Sean, when he mentioned politicians earlier making donations, he didn't mention TDs, he mentioned councillors, so I think that's me off the hook. But there's two councillors on at the back, John Hearn and Jim Griffin, so make sure, Sean, you get both of those in a pledge from them before they leave. And it's great that there has been strong engagement with local councillors and TDs with yourself, and I want to commend the work that the network has done, Joe and yourself in your work, and Sean and everyone involved over the last number of years. As you know, I've had many meetings with you, and we've attended many events, not organised even by ourselves, but many events supporting people with disabilities. It's really important that we have organisations that advocate, that support, that network, and that do all of the work that needs to be done to support children and adults with disabilities. And your own organisation is one that I think is renowned for the huge work that you've done, so I want to commend you first for all of that. I'll start, I suppose, with just speaking about a meeting that I attended a number of weeks ago in Leinster House, and I have to say it was one of the toughest meetings that I saw. It was organised by our spokesperson for disabilities, Pauline Tully. She's a TD from Cavan Monaghan, and we were campaigning over the last number of months on the waiting lists for the assessments of need for children with disabilities, but also access to services. So that's the big issue for a lot of children. They just can't get access to speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, child psychology, whatever the issue is, whatever the need is. Far too many children, as we know, are waiting for too long. And we uncovered lots of problems in the system, which I will get to later. So we organised a meeting in Leinster House, and we had, I think, about 30 parents of children with autism and disabilities. And each of the parents held up a photograph of their child, and all those emotions that you spoke about, all of the feelings that they had for their child, the love and the support and so on. But then they talked about the challenges and how difficult it was. And they also talked about how difficult it was for the siblings, for their own parents, grandparents and others in the family as well. And they made the same point that the focus very often rightly is on the child and the person with disabilities, but we also have to put a focus on the people who care for them, including carers, but also the family members as well. And it just struck me because it was really emotive, because when they were holding up the photographs and when they were talking about those range of emotions and how difficult and challenging it was, there was also a real anger behind it all as well, because the reason why we were there, and they all had the same experience. Probably 95%, I would say, of the parents that spoke had a negative experience of their child getting services or not getting services. And it was just heartbreaking to hear one parent after the other. And it was really difficult because there was parents with a range of ages. So we had some parents of children who were 5 or 6, and then some parents of children who were maybe 15, 16 and maybe older. And I felt it was disheartening in some respects, but honest and probably necessary for the parents of the younger children to hear about the experience of what happened to those who opportunities passed them by, supports passed them by, early intervention passed them by. And then they were talking about how difficult it was when trying to get a diagnosis, struggling to understand how do we get access to services, how do we get access to education, how do we get all of these therapies and supports which are meant to be out there, and working through the maze of all of that and not being properly supported. And then far too many of them talking about children who got no services or very little or patchy services. And then those children are now adults or young adults or teenagers, and the opportunities to develop that they should have had weren't given to them, and it passed them by. So it was really heartbreaking. And I suppose as somebody who wants to be a future Minister for Health, if I get the opportunity, it struck me that for me is one of the key issues that I want to focus on. And it's why Jim and myself held a public meeting in Tramore on that issue a number of months ago, and I've done about 16 or 17 meetings across the state on similar issues, including in Tipperary, in Cavan and Monaghan and Donegal, and lots of different areas. So I went on the road and met a lot of parents and a lot of children with disabilities. So I want to now talk about some of the problems, but also I think focus on some of the solutions as well, because we can provide better services, and I think we will provide better services, and things can improve. But one of the challenges in coming to a meeting like this, more so if you're going to a meeting where we have parents of children with disabilities, it's really difficult because they've heard it all before, and they've been in lots of meetings over many years where all sorts of promises were made, and they've told their story over and over and over and over again, to the point that they feel nobody is listening, and that's the hard part. And I can completely understand that. So even the reasonable accommodation issue, which is a very basic right, the fact that you have to campaign for that is just nonsense. And I'm conscious as well, although I'm the health spokesperson, and disabilities, as we know, was under the Department of Health, it's now moving over to the Department of Children and Youth Affairs and now disabilities. The area of disabilities, yes, health is one part of it, but it's also about access to transport. It's also about the issues that were raised in relation to education, employability, and so on. So it's much broader than health, but obviously I look at it from my perspective, from the health side, and what I can bring to it. So I might just focus on the issue of the waiting lists, and I suppose what we uncovered working with legal people, but also working with parents of children with disabilities over the last number of months. It's not anything that would be new to anybody in the room, or even wasn't anything new to me, but to have it all confirmed, and when you get the data and you look at the actual figures, and then you talk to parents and you talk to children and you see what children are not getting, and then you see how stark the waiting lists are, it is really frustrating. I have to say it is something that makes people angry, and rightly so. So I'll start first of all with the whole process of assessment of need. Maybe just start there first. And that was the first area that I looked at, because we were being told by the Minister for Disabilities that we were getting through the waiting lists, that the numbers of children who were waiting for an assessment of need had dramatically come down, and the waiting lists were now down to about 500 or 600 children, where it was about 6,000 or 7,000. And there was huge work being done. They were horsing through these waiting lists, and children were getting the assessments, and then they were going to get all of these services on the other end of it. And we were in the Dáil, in Dáil exchanges or in committee meetings hearing this and saying, well, that's great. And then you go to a meeting and you find out, actually, that's not what we're being told by parents. So what's going wrong? What's the difference? So as we know, they changed the procedure and how they were carrying out assessments, and they moved from a full multidisciplinary assessment to a preliminary teams assessment, it's called, when they reshaped or reorganised the disability services under PDS and established the Children's Disability Network teams. So when that happened, they started to do these preliminary team assessments, which were essentially a screening that could take maybe 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, and it wasn't a proper assessment. But they were saying it was an assessment, and then somebody was being taken off a list, and that was then being able to demonstrate that the lists were being reduced. So we worked with a number of legal people who took a high court case and they won. And the HSE then was found to have been in breach of the law, that the preliminary team assessments were struck out. They've now been stopped, and the HSE has now been forced to go back to the drawing board and look at how they now deliver assessments of need. And since then, because I'll follow on to the next part, which is the more important part, access to services, I obviously engage with lots of parents, and they say, yes, the assessment of need is important, and yes, it's an issue, but what's more important to me is that my child gets the services that the child needs, and that's really what I want to focus on. And then we started to look at the waiting lists and the numbers of children who were waiting. So as of now, as of yesterday, the most recent figures that I got, there's just under 51,000 children on some form of waiting list for children with disabilities, on some form of waiting list, whether it's speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, child psychology, physiotherapy, across all of the areas and disciplines. Of the Children's Disability Network teams that were established, there's 91 of them, as you know, established or meant to be established across the state. Most of them are up and running. There is just under 2,100 posts which are funded for these teams. Of those 2,100 posts, there are 730 vacant posts. So 1 in 3 posts are vacant because they can't get the staff to fill them. And because of that, and I followed it up then to say, well, what does that mean then in terms of hours of services? So if those 730 posts were filled, what would that mean? It would mean 480,000 hours of therapy and services would go to children. So the converse of that is, because the posts are vacant, we have 480,000 hours of services that children are not getting because we can't fill the posts. And that's just incredible, but that's where we are at the moment. And for me, that's shocking. And then I bring myself back to the meeting that I was at, where parents were holding up photographs of their children, talking about their experience, talking about the fact that they would do anything, and were pleading with the HSE, pleading with the system to provide the services, waiting and waiting and waiting for a letter to come to say their child was going to get access to services, and then the services never come. And it's really shocking. So that's one of the areas that I certainly want to focus on and I want to change. It will only change if we start training more therapists. We have to ratchet up the training places so we have more coming out. But we also learned in the course of examining what was happening and looking at these Children's Disability Network teams, there's 18 different organisations providing the service. And I don't know how that works, but it doesn't work all that well. The HSE is the main provider. Enable Ireland is the second main provider, and then there are 16 other Section 39 charity organisations. You have 18 different organisations that staff these network teams, and we have different rates of pay and pension entitlements in terms of conditions of employment. So imagine a network team of 7 or 8 staff, specialists or therapists and psychologists and so on one team, and we have 3 maybe working for the HSE and 4 working for non-HSE providers on different rates of pay, not getting the same maternity entitlements, not getting the same terms and conditions of employment, not having the same pension rates, doing exactly the same work. So how can you retain staff? How can you recruit staff if that's happening? And you know, we've made very strong presentations to Paul Reid, the head of the HSE, at a Oireachtas committee a number of weeks ago. That got very heated, and he didn't like some of the criticism where a number of us said that those who are providing the services or managing the services at a very senior level, and I in fact said everybody in the room should be ashamed that we're not providing the services to children, that we have all of these vacant posts, that we have so many hours not being delivered, but so many children just being let down. So that's the issue in relation to the Children's Disability Network teams. Because we've shone a spotlight on it, hopefully we will see improvements, and the HSE are now looking at recruiting abroad, dealing with some of those retention issues. They have to now go away and cost how much it would cost to provide pay parity for all the staff across all of those grades. They're looking at an apprentice model, they're looking at sponsorship model, lots of ideas that we would have thrown in there that they are now beginning to look at, and hopefully we will see some positives to it. Just a couple of other things I want to say as well. So when you were talking about the trains and the carriages and not being designed for a person with a disability, or having to phone in advance to get a ramp, it reminded me of a meeting that we had in Waterford a number of weeks ago, and one of our party members, Carol, who you would know attended the meeting, it was on housing, and he spoke very well, and he spoke about, as a person with a disability, the impact that the housing crisis has on him. So it affects everybody. When you were talking about a ramp, there was no wheelchair access into the room that we had. So again, we have to think as a party when we're organising events, and it wasn't us that organised the meeting, in fact it was a different organisation, but we were there and we had encouraged party members to come. Carol came, and it took about 15 minutes for us to get Carol into the room. Unfortunately, the ramp snapped, and Jim at the back broke 3 of his toes when the wheelchair came down and fell back on his foot. Unfortunately for Jim, but again, it just showed that, you know, a simple thing like that in the 21st century, that we don't have hotels with proper access for children with disabilities. There's a couple of things that we will focus on in our alternative budget this year. Obviously, the issue of Children's Disability Network teams, properly resourcing them, dealing with the recruitment and the retention issues are really important. Family carers, who I also have a grow for, and we would have done a number of meetings with them over the last number of years. We developed a new charter for carers ourselves that we published last year, that we want to obviously deliver from government, that deals with a lot of the needs of carers, because it goes back to what we said earlier. We have to care for the people who care or who have disabilities, and obviously young carers need to be supported. But there's issues in relation to respite, there's issues in relation to overnight respite, there's issues in relation to the means testing of the payment, for example. So there's a whole range of issues that we had in our charter, and they will appear again in our alternative budget this year, and we'll put pressure on the government. There is a new Oireachtas committee on autism that it's going to sit for about 9 months. It's going to focus on a new autism strategy. I hope that it will deal with all of those issues that you raised, and I think that you should, if I can get your details, if I was you, I would write into that committee asking to appear before them as a witness, because we want to hear from people who have professionals and people who have researched in this area as well, because if we're going to develop a new autism strategy, we need to get it right, in my view, and we've been looking for this for a long time, so we're really pleased that the committee is in place. And it can't just be a talking shop, you know, that we have 9 months of more conversations. We want a really comprehensive, rights-based
and adults,
autism
children
strategy.
who, sorry to interrupt you, children who finish school, like my son is 18, he's just left St. John's, he's autistic. They need support.
Yeah.
Where does he know? We haven't got a confirmed place for him yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to get onto that part of it in a second, in terms of the next parts of what we'll be proposing in our budget, and also issues that we've been campaigning on. So the autism strategy, I think, would be really important, and it isn't just for children, it's obviously for adults as well, but it hopefully it'll be a really comprehensive one that would make a difference. There's lots of issues obviously that impact on adults, and I certainly will have no problem talking to yourself about your own experience recently as well, and see if we can raise that issue to make sure it doesn't happen again. It shouldn't be happening. Decongregation is one of the policy areas that obviously we've been looking at to make sure that we take people out of institutional settings and this is for people with intellectual disabilities, to make sure that, you know, they're in proper residential places, assisted living, respite houses. We want an additional respite house in each CHO area, all of those areas. So there's no one solution, there's lots of different things that we have to get right, and we're committed to getting it right. So all I'll say is that I have a real grow, I have to say, for people who support and look after people with disabilities, because it's a really difficult job, and I've seen it firsthand, carers and the work that they do as well, like the physical element of it alone, particularly if you're looking after an older person and you're a younger person, you have to lift them, you have to wash them, like it's an amazing job, and you save the state an absolute fortune by the work that you do. So everything that we can do to support carers should be done, but all of those in the room that advocate for people with disabilities deserve not just our praise, but deserve our support as well. So whatever we can do, whatever I can do, obviously as a TD, we certainly will help, and we certainly will assist in whatever way we can. Obviously, my objective is I want to be in government. That's obviously a different matter. It's a matter for the electorate, it's a matter for people outside of the room, but it's an aspiration that obviously we hold. And if we get in, the issue of disabilities and the issue of carers are two issues that Mary Lou MacDonald has identified as key for her, because of their importance, because as a party that supports a rights-based approach to all policy and empowerment, that's what it's about. It's about empowering people with disabilities, it's about making sure that the supports that they need, they get. Can we solve all the problems overnight? No. But can we set the whole process in a new direction, and set a direction of travel which is about a rights-based approach? I think we can, and part of it is getting the strategies right, but more importantly, resourcing all of the strategies as well. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you for listening. I don't know if there's any questions and answer session, probably if there is, that's fine, but if not, I'll be here for a while anyway, I can speak to people afterwards. And thank you again, Joe and Sean, for inviting me. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.